All right, my young friends, we are about to enter our cell unit, and so we are going to get your introductory information about the study of cells, which is also called cytology. Please take advantage. This podcast, the raw PowerPoint for this podcast is also on our ColemanBiology.com page, and if you want, you can go to the PowerPoint itself and click on some of the links that are kind of interesting if you are interested in this kind of stuff. But cytology, the study of cells. Now, we do have to do our obligatory old dead guy history lesson here, so please bear with me. But some really incredibly important old dead guys that came up with some amazing inventions that allowed us to see things that humans could never have known existed without the invention of microscopes. Cytology, the study of cells, would not have been possible if it weren't for the invention of the microscope. Now, a guy named Zacharias Janssen, and you really do not need to remember his name, but just so you understand, he is credited with truly the invention of the microscope. We don't usually learn about him because his microscopes were not that great. They were only about 10 times magnification, but that was way better than nothing. But at least it got the ball rolling. So, and if you look, we are talking late 1500s for this invention. Okay? Now, Anton von Leeuwenhoek is usually who gets credited with the first microscope, even though he really wasn't the first. But he certainly was the first that had a really decent microscope. So that's usually why he's credited with it. Had the best early microscopes, very, very high magnifications for the time, up to about 300 times, which is just a little bit less than what our microscopes in our class do, which do about 400. He was using these in around the 1600s. And this is one of his microscopes. And you might look at this microscope and you might say, Coleman, that doesn't look like a microscope. And I would agree with you. I'm going to post an Edmodo link to a little video clip where Bill Nye is actually talking with a guy and looks at a model of this, and they show you how it worked. Anton von Leeuwenhoek was the first to do something, and what he was the first to do was to observe living cells, okay? He looked at pond water, he looked at various embarrassing body fluids that had bacteria swimming around in them. He would scrape plaque from, I presume, his own teeth or whatever, and could see bacteria in them. There's a little bullet here about Hooke, but I'm going to get to him in a minute. These are some of the images. These guys that were doing this work, if you were going to do scientific work and make observations, you needed to be able to draw back in this time. And they were very good artists, and you can see he made some very careful drawings of what he saw when he removed plaque from his teeth. And what we would call these now is bacteria. That's exactly what they were. And we can look at them and figure that out pretty easily now. He did not know that the word bacteria wasn't around yet, and he called these animalcules. He could see them moving. You can see little dotted lines where he indicates that this critter moved. But at any rate, the first to see living cells. Now, Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke did not invent the first microscope. He didn't have the best microscope, but what he did do was he coined the term that we still use today, and that is the term cell, okay? He did a lot of observations using a microscope. He did not make them himself, though he was involved with it. And he coined this term cell when he was observing cork cells, which is essentially like tree bark. And he published many of his observations, not just the cork, but in this book called Micrographia, and he had many detailed pictures of what he looked at. This book influenced many others. His naming of the term of the cell, of course, influences us still today, and so on. Now, this is what his microscope looked like. and you can see the year is 1670, so we're almost a century past that very, very first microscope in the late 1500s. You can see this is a bit more elaborate than Leeuwenhoek's, but it's not necessarily as good, but more elaborate and better to work with. The eye cup and various parts to this microscope allowed it to be held steady. It focused more light on the subject, and so on. So now his drawings that he made. Here are his cork cells, very famous drawing. There's a flea, lots of different things he observed. But again, Leeuwenhoek was the first to observe actually living cells. Okay? Now, here's another dead guy, Robert Brown, and this guy is important for us because he was the first to actually observe a nucleus, which I'm sure you know is the brains, so to speak, of your cells, at the center of a cell. In fact, it was the first time anyone had observed an organelle, a compartment in a cell. No one knew what this structure did, nobody needed, but he could tell it was a structure inside a cell, and that's what made it something different than anyone had seen before. He did this in the 1800s, so you can see a lot of time had passed between Robert Hooke and Leeuwenhoek, and then finally getting to this point where we're actually able to see organelles inside cells, little cell parts. This instrument is the microscope that Brown worked with, and this is what he would have seen when he was looking at an orchid leaf, and these are the cells of that leaf here, and these little guys here are the nuclei of the cells. These guys are not. These are different. Okay, now that's pretty much our microscope guys. Now we're on to some other guys that made some pretty bold statements, and we're going to see why those are important in just a minute. These guys that we're about to talk about helped us to create what is called the cell theory. So, first guy, Matthias Schleiden. He, after many, many observations that not only he did, but many others before him did, came to the conclusion and stated that all plants appeared to be made out of cells. Okay, he did this in 1838. So we've been observing cells for over 2 centuries now, or microscopic structures at any rate. And it's not until here that we finally get someone saying, okay, it seems like all these plants are made out of cells. Theodor Schwann took the other half of this idea and said that all animals appeared to be made out of cells, and he said this in 1839, so right on the heels of Schleiden. And please use the trick if you can't remember who said what. Remember, Schwann sounds like swan, and that's an animal, so he said all animals are made of cells. Now, Virchow, and I'm certain that I'm not pronouncing that correctly because I believe it is Russian, all said that all cells are made from other cells. In other words, cells don't just poof here from nothingness. He said that cells are created from other cells. He said this some 20 years almost after Schleiden and Schwann were saying their ideas. Before this guy, it was thought that cells could arise spontaneously from non-living things, and he said no, based on his observations, building off of other people's observations. Now, these 3 men, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow, gave us what we call the cell theory, okay? Combining those ideas together, okay? Please remember, before we talk about the cell theory, remember what it means to be a theory, okay? It is not just a theory, just somebody's theory. No, that we use theory in everyday terms like it means opinion. That's not what it means in science. In science, a theory is a heavily substantiated body of work with a lot of evidence supporting it. So a theory is supported by a huge body of evidence. It has been tested many times. It explains many things, not just one thing. It explains our observations about many things. And it can be, even if we believe that it is a very good theory, it can always be revised or improved. But as it stands now, it is our best explanations for the observations that we've got. That's what a theory is. It is not stagnant. It changes as evidence becomes more clear. It supports a huge body of work and is supported by a huge body of work. So theories are a big deal in science. Now, here is the cell theory. All living things are made of cells. So this is Schleiden and Schwann here. All plants, all animals, all living things, even things that are not plants and animals, are made of cell. Cells are the basic units of structure and function. Basically, the cell is the smallest thing you can have that's still a living thing. If you can get smaller than a cell, but then you're down to molecules and those aren't alive, okay? And all cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells don't just poof here out of nothingness. Okay, so that is the cell theory. You should be aware of it and know it. Okay, now I'm going to stop there. The next section is on microscopes. We've done microscopes already, except for we have not really talked very much about electron microscopes. So I'm going to make this a separate podcast. You have a section in your notes on it. You can go through and do them real quickly, or you can skip them. I'm going to leave that up to you. We have covered most of this material. I do recommend you come in here and get the electron microscope stuff. But as far as the terms for the compound microscope, we do have those already from earlier in the year. You may see those again on a test or a quiz or something like that. So I'm just giving you a heads up. But you have had them already. If you feel like you know them well, then don't worry about it. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next podcast.